Welcome back to Writers Read. So glad we're here today. We get to hear two more writers read, Simon Ottenberg and Anne Brand. It's our treat to hear writers read. But we know to start with Paul's poem. Here we go. I say a line, you say a line. Write, write, write.
Write, write, write.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Then read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And bring us great delight.
And bring us great delight.
Oh, I like that poem so much. Simon, it's so good to see you again. And before we gathered today, I went into our library and went to the back shelf in the library to see what was there by Simon Ottenberg. And these are the books that are in that collection. And I'm going to hold them up so everybody can see them. Say the first name here for me.
Olyanka.
Olyanka, A Woman's View. Here's the next.
This was an artist from Sierra Leone.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Say whatever you'd like to, dear heart, about these books. This book is Seeing with Music, the lives of 3 blind African musicians. This one is about Ron Hilbert, the life and work of a Coast Salish artist. The last one that we have is New Traditions from Nigeria, 7 artists of the
Nsukka.
There you go, Nsukka group.
That's a university in Nigeria.
Okay, but take some moments to go to that back shelf in the library. It's amazing, and these 4 books will be there of Simon's. Okay, Simon, what are you reading for us today?
I'm reading a story from southeastern Nigeria about 1910, the turn when it was a colonial country under Britain at that time, the start of its colonialism. The essay is called Farmlands. It was March, the time to turn over the earth and to plant the crops. The rain would come, for the first thin white clouds were appearing over Akere village. It was the time for the families to leave their village homes to disperse to the small, separate farm settlements and to begin the hard work of rice planting. After preparing the earth, it was the time for men and women together to place the rice seedlings one by one in lines, each plant separated by a regular distance from the next seedling, as if it were military units. It was also a time for men to plant the yam seedlings and for women to plant vegetables. It was the time that Krakow appeared in Akere village after 8 years' absence, living in the city, schooling in missionary schools, British missionary schools, and working there. On his return, Krakow and his family were welcomed by his entire community as if he was the first individual from the village who had studied in a secondary school and had worked in a city. There was feasting, there was music by the village drummers and by a horn player. There was a girls' dancing group, an exhibition of men's wrestling, a specialty of the village. There was much drinking of palm wine and native gin. Everyone was pleased to see how successful Krakow had been. He even wore different style shoes than they had ever seen before.
Oh my.
He soon met with the village farmers who hoped he would help them to learn new farming methods. A farmer speaking in the local dialect asked him about growing yams, the primary male crop. Krakow replied that he did not study that and he couldn't assist them, but he did learn English in school. None of the farmers spoke English. A woman asked him whether he could teach them how to grow better vegetables. Krakow replied that he never learned about growing vegetables, but that he studied Shakespeare in school. A woman asked him, what did Shakespeare grow? He replied, no, it was a play. The farmers grew quiet, not understanding what a play was. Eager to show his knowledge, Krakow said, I learned all about the kings of England. Were the kings farmers? No, but farmers worked for them. Did they grow yams? No, it was too cold. A farmer queried, we have heard that there are better forms of rice than we grow. Tell us about them. You should consult the agricultural department. But I learned about the British Empire in school. I can tell you many stories about it. The farmers gradually ceased asking questions and dispersed, disappointed in learning nothing about farming from this educated man. They began to ignore him. Krakow had come to reside in a Kere village at the end of the major dry season. When weddings had been held, initiations into the men's secret society, the yam festivals, the memorial services for the deceased, the taking of the settling of farmland ownership disputes. And farming had begun. With the time, it had been a time of considerable socializing. When it ended, almost everyone turned to independent family living on the crops for some 5 months. At least they did so about 1910, when this story took place. Krakow's father was responsible for allocating the farmland of the family. The scattered plots each had a name that distinguished it: cola nut, raccoon, eggplant, thornbush, crickets. The family members gathered at a designated place where the father told each one where he or she should farm for a year. The general rule was that you farmed the same land every year. It was available within a system of land rotation. Adjustments were made for old age, deaths, marriages, growing children. During Krakow's long absence, one of his prized land sections, bananas, had been farmed 4 times by Inoko, a younger brother. Inoko refused to give up the farmland to his older brother, as he should have. A serious dispute broke out between the 2 brothers over the land. Krakow noted that he had farmed the land before he left for the city. He stated, "I have returned to live in the village, and this farmland is mine to farm. It is not the property of my younger brother." But his father, who could not believe that after 8 years in the city that he really wanted to farm, said that the younger brother had had farmed it 4 times in rotation, and that Krakow no longer had a claim to it. The family had allocated a much less desirable plot of land to the older brother to Krakow. The land was called Pebbles. The older brother protested, "Even though I have been away 8 years, I know our people's customs. Age conquers everything else. I am the older brother. I am entitled to the land back." He attempted to farm bananas, but the father called in relatives and they threw him off it. Distraught, the older brother took his complaint to the village head, who was on his own farmland some distance away. He refused to support the older brother's claim, saying, "You were away for 8 years and not farming with the family. Go farm where you have been living for 8 years, or farm the land allocated to you. Show that you're still a farmer. If you do well, your father will give you better land to farm next year." Although Kwaku decided to stay, no one could understand that after 8 years in the city, going to schools and working there, that he wanted to return to village life. He told himself he did not know why, but it was quiet life. He wanted peaceful life. City life was not happy life for him. He had missed his relatives and friends in the village. Krakow did not understand what was happening to him. He complained about his farmland allocation to the village chief, who said to him that your land allocation has been decided by your father correctly at the family level, even though it breaks the principle of age priority. If you stay and live as a villager, your age rights will be restored in time. Krakow realized that he was no longer a member of the village, and he quietly left for the city, where he obtained a job as a colonial government clerk. His wife and their children were pleased to return to the city. She did little farming at Akero. She had vegetables sent from her favorite store in the city. The children were at first interested to be in a rural area, but they soon found little to do there. Although they objected to schooling in the city, the country school did not stimulate them, and the dialect was somewhat strange to their ears. When villagers, especially the fathers, saw that Krakow's father, a respected village member, had not followed the customary age rule in the case of his eldest son, and nothing terrible had happened to him. Nothing mysterious, no illness, no nothing. Other village fathers began to break the rules as well. Then young adults, seeing that the fathers were not following the rules, began to break them too also. and left for the city. Within a few years, there only remained a few middle-aged farmers and old and ill people in the village who did little farming. The village was one of many in the region without a tradition of hired labor, and it was to be many years before the existence of migrant labor came to Ekere village.
Oh my goodness, Simon, you always bring us what I call food for thought. This was food for thought. I'm going to give it thought, and thank you so much for your reading. It was wonderful.
I enjoyed doing it. Sorry about my voice.
And here we have another writer reading. Anne Brand, welcome so much, dear friend. I wrote Anne earlier in the week to give thought to some of her earlier writing experiences and whether writing was always an easy form of communication, whether it was a choice she would make easily rather than dread. And tell us a little bit about how you got started writing.
Well, I have always written something as part of being a student and being in a career, but all of it was technical writing or essay writing, focused on what was required of whatever the task might have been at the time. And I had done very little creative writing, nor much journaling growing up. So at Horizon House, there was a teacher who came, a writing teacher who came here and gave a class named Peggy Sturdivant, and I wanted to explore whether or not I could do something else. Plus the fact it was a time when I was taking great joy in my grandson, who was going crazy about airplanes and aviation, and being a pilot, I thought, I think I'll write my flying experiences as a gift. So I went to this class and was encouraged by Peggy to get going. And I'm going to start with one of the excerpts from this account, and then I'm going to shift to more personal, other kinds of writing, if that's okay.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Okay, I'm going to start off with a piece out of my flying history, and this little piece is called Gaining Proficiency. I soloed after 10 hours of flight instruction. The next 16 hours were drills. Practice, practice, practice of the exercises designed to improve my coordination and skill handling the airplane. Among my instructor's favorites, his name was Jim, by the way, were slow flight, stalls, turns, and takeoffs and landings, all of which are kind of essential. Slow flight, requiring me to establish an altitude and heading, then in increments of 10 degrees add wing flaps. The goal was to be able to fly straight and level with the flaps extended at an airspeed barely above stalling. Jim was satisfied when the stall warning horn was going off, meaning that the wing was about to lose lift and was going to stop flying. My job was to keep it straight on that edge until he said, okay. To begin with, I couldn't see the usefulness of this exercise, since under no circumstances could I imagine flying like that on purpose. Flaps are of particular importance, however, when making takeoffs and landings at short and over soft fields, when you must descend and take off at a steeper angle at lower airspeeds than usual. Accomplishing straight and level slow flight was just the beginning. Once it was established, I was directed to make a 360-degree turn, first right and then left, without a change in altitude. I never could do it perfectly, but I got an acceptable and dependable level of proficiency when I accomplished a turn without going up or down more than 50 feet. Could roll out of the turn zone close to the same heading I had going into the turn, and when I could retrim the airplane and resume normal flight attitude and airspeed without losing or gaining altitude. As for stalls, all kinds, all attitudes, and all conditions, especially in slip flight. Turns, normal rate, steep turns, slipping turns, all to be performed with whatever altitude control Jim called out. For example, 360 degrees standard rate turn descending 500 feet. Takeoffs and landings, over and over, as touch and goes. On days when there was a 5 to 10 knot crosswind across the runway, Jim was eager for me to fly and gain experience handling crosswind conditions. One of Jim's favorite techniques for pushing the envelope of my confidence in a particularly dicey, to me, approach to a landing was for him to fold his arms and remind me, "It's your airplane." There were a few occasions when he had to intervene, and many more when I fervently wished he would. But as I gained experience with this practice of his, I learned that he would not let me get into serious trouble, just as I learned that when he challenged me, trying to do the task and failing taught me just as much as success. I began living the truism that my only competition was my last best effort. One day, we started a lesson at about 3 in the afternoon. I was scheduled to have the airplane for an hour with Jim. The sky was clear, but over the last few days, we had been having a weather pattern typical for coastal Southern California in the summer. Low stratus clouds, fog, in the morning, which usually burned off by about 10 a.m., then rolled back in late in the afternoon. I loved those days and the relief from midsummer heat. The Santa Monica Airport had one runway on a roughly east-west axis. The prevailing wind was usually from the coast, so planes took off and landed to the west. I noticed the wind was picking up, no doubt a harbinger of the arrival of the low stratus layer expected late in the afternoon. As we asked for takeoff clearance, Jim told me to announce that we would be staying in the pattern. In other words, we would be making touch and goes. Traffic control appreciated being told this so that other aircraft could be spaced accordingly. The first 2 go-rounds were unremarkable. I did have to add in more crosswind correction than usual to hold the heading on the approach. No big deal. Then the 3rd time, just as we were leaving the tower, Jim pulled the power off and said, "Emergency landing." Now, he did this regularly when we were out in the practice areas. My job was to locate a spot where I could put the plane down, establish a power-off glide and approach, and head for the emergency landing. Aviate, navigate, communicate was the mantra that by now automatically came into my head when he declared an emergency. We always pulled up once he was satisfied I had performed the emergency landing sequence correctly, which quite frankly was only about 80% of the time. This time I thought, well, there's the runway. All I have to do is continue the approach and land. Except, as I established the glide speed on the downwind leg of the approach and started to turn to the base leg, I realized that I had not counted on the onshore wind. I discovered I did not have enough altitude and reached for the throttle to add power. Jim lightly tapped me on the wrist and reminded me, no power. There was no doubt in my mind that I was not going to make it. "Still your airplane," Jim said. I picked up the mic. "Santa Monica Tower, Cessna Sierra Foxtrot going around. Niner Sierra Foxtrot, go round approved. Maintain spacing in the pattern." "Roger, Niner Sierra Foxtrot." I added power, climbed to 200 feet to reach the pattern altitude, leveled off as I flew above the runway and prepared to turn crosswind. To enter the downwind portion of my approach, Jim was quiet. I executed the next 2 touch and goes, albeit I was still feeling a little shaky, with a moderate wrench in my gut and worry about what Jim was going to say when we debriefed the lesson. My lifelong need to do it right gave me no quarter. As the lesson ended, we could see the fog bank beginning to encroach over the beach. We taxied back to the tie-down area with a stop at the gas pump to top off the tanks. There was no conversation. We headed over to the Kitty Hawk coffee shop for coffee as we debriefed. "You did okay," Jim began. "I did? But I messed up the approach." "Yeah, but you solved the problem. How many times have I told you, do something even if it's wrong? Chances are it'll be right, and it's certainly better than doing nothing." Once again, making a mistake proved to be invaluable. Another notch had been cut in my self-confidence belt, not because I did it right, but because I recovered from the mistake and got the job done. And as I headed home from the airport, relishing being softly enveloped by the incoming fog, I thought to myself, I really do love to fly.
Oh, wow. Oh, I can start breathing again.
I'm shifting gears now I'm shifting gears to a reminiscence of a very interesting and traumatic event in my life when I was 11 to 14 years old. And it's called Tailwind. I think it was the Christmas of 1948. It was the Christmas of 1948. It was a beautiful morning. We children dove into our Christmas stockings before breakfast, as was our tradition. We had breakfast with all 5 of us seated around the dining room table. The nighttime weather had been merciful. There had been no frost warnings, and no one had to be up all night ready to go out and fire the smudge pots in the orchard. After breakfast, we began the ritual of opening presents and sharing with each other what treasures were unwrapped. Our practice was to take turns. One person was a scribe, so that we would all know from whom each gift came, and one person was Santa, carefully reading the gift tags and distributing the bounty. At age 11, and being the youngest, I had neither role. Mother always assured that each of us would receive one, quote, important gift. And she usually engineered the process so that this one would be the last one each of us would receive. As this morning rolled by and it became time for the big one, my sister and brother each received theirs. But there was nothing particularly big under the tree for me. I was trying to hide my hurt and pretend I had not noticed that we had reached the stage when there was nothing left to open. But no one was showing the usual impatience to be done with this ritual, so we could all split to call our friends and take our gifts off to explore in detail. It was all I could do not to cry. I just wanted to get out of there. About this time, Mrs. Freer, our housekeeper, came into the living room and said, "What's this I see outside?" We all looked out the big living room window. Mother, my sister Courtney, my brother Edson, and I all saw Ann Denny riding a horse around the corner of the garage, and with him was a gangly, broom-tailed colt. I don't think there was a dry eye in the room. Thus began my adventure with Tailwind. My sister thought of the name and I loved it. Tailwind was just about 5 months old, barely weaning age, when he arrived on that Christmas morning. My little buckskin horse, Plum, had been in the family for a number of years. By the time he was mine, he was reliable and wise in the ways of teaching the inexperienced how to be around horses. I figured he would comfort this little colt that was pining for his mother, so I put them in together from the very beginning. They bonded immediately and lastingly. Whenever I rode out on Plum and left Tailwind behind, I could hear him whinnying for Plum until I was out of range. As time went on, I took Tailwind along with us. Wherever we went, and if it was safe to do so, I didn't even bother with a lead rope. Tailwind kept close enough in spite of his occasionally straying a little to explore intriguing smells and objects along the way. When I reached my destination, I did not tie Tailwind, but I always tied Plum. It worked perfectly. For the next 2+ years, I trained Tailwind as best I could. We knew each other so well that I learned early on I had to ask him to respond to me and demonstrate how pleased I was when he did. He was a lot stronger than I was and could remind me of that whenever he chose. Mostly he liked to please me, so much so in fact that he taught me how to cue what I wanted in ways that no one watching us could see. The summer he was killed, I had been riding him for just a few months. He had passed his 3rd birthday. I was coming up on my 14th. I was enormously pleased with how he was doing. It was a hot day. My friend Nina and I often rode together. We chose to ride either early in the day or late after the heat began to dissipate. This day, we went on an early ride. We got back about 9 a.m. and we parted company at the bottom of the long drive that led up to my house. I turned Tailwind out into the lower pasture and walked up to the house. I heard him whinny after the other horse and thought nothing of it. He enjoyed company since Plum was no longer with us. About noon that day, I was sitting in the coolest part of the house. I heard what I later learned was Tailwind's scream. Whether he actually screamed, I do not know, but I heard him. At the time, I did not connect that sound with Tailwind. Some time passed before the phone rang. I was told someone wanted to speak with me. It was a man's voice. "Do you have a great gelding?" "Yes," I said. "There's been an accident." He has been hit by a car. You had better come. We have called the constable. My stepfather drove me down the hill to the bottom of our driveway. I saw Tailwind lying on the highway. I went to him, spoke to him. He whickered his greeting to me. He was in shock, frightened, but clearly comforted by my voice. His hoof was severed when his foreleg went through the windshield of the car that hit him. I sat on the ground and arranged his head on my lap. I crooned to him until I saw his eyes begin to glaze over and his head relax into me. When the constable came with his rifle, I would not let go. I was pulled away and then led away. The sound of that shot is as real to me today as it was that morning. Living was never again as simple as it had been. I lost the unquestioning conviction that all would be well. I did not know I would live through and beyond this crushing loss. But I quickly learned that comfort offered was not the same as understanding, and that maybe some wounds will never close.
Oh, man. Thank you for sharing that.
Some more? I got time?
Yes, good shape.
Okay. Turning now to more current stuff, and the writing class encouraging me to keep trying to describe things without talking about them, if that makes sense. This was an attempt. It's called One Night in Amelie's Bed. I fold into Amelie's bed and read a while by her bedside light. My thoughts drift away from words. They creep toward imagining Amelie in this bed at night, hearing as I do the faint hum of the aquarium motor. There are no fish in her aquarium. The pH of the water is monitored. There are a few green plants, their broad green leaves waving in the slow current. There are no fish. Amelie is afraid she will be too sad when a fish dies. The aquarium light is turned off this night for my comfort. The house is quiet, and this room is dark when I turn out the light. I'm comfy in this bed, surrounded by Amelie's treasured stuffies, except for the one she has with her in her nest-like bed on the floor between the wall and the big bed in her parents' room. I imagine Amelie's voice giving speech to each of her named, finger-sized princess dolls as they regale one another with tales befitting the story each comes with. Her jumbled treasures, seashells, coins, a beaded bracelet she made with her mom, bathing suit pieces for a doll, and so many tiny forest animals, all adorn a small table in the top of her chest of drawers. Books spill out of overfull bookcases, and the drawers of her toy chest won't close. Amelie is 8. I wish I could find a way to talk with her. We wrote a story together about a squirrel named Scramble.
That's very nice. Very nice.
I have just 2 more.
We're good. We're just fine.
Okay. This is another writing class effort. And I'm writing about getting the news from some mutual friends that my first boyfriend had died. This was just a couple of years ago. And we had stayed in touch through mutual friends. So this is what I wrote about that. It's called I'm Getting the News. With the news of your death, I was put on pause, enveloped in the rich darkness of grief. I ached to recall it, all of it, all at once. I sank, but didn't drown. Instead, I began to surface into sunlight dappling through the sycamores, dancing on the water, warming my back as the bunch of us collapsed in the meadow after a running game. Blind, groping toward each other, mystified, captured. Firsts, fear, thrills. Then awash in awareness of others. Loss, moving on, not leaving you where I found you. You became a permanent resident in my no longer alien heart. Shall I start with, do you remember the 2 Summers on Orcus? Ronnie Bennett, Midsummer Night's Dream, Winter's Tale, Wendy, Our Coming Together, Our Breaking Apart? I remember.
Oh,
And this last one. Some of you remember Barbara Frederick. She was in the writing class for a while. And one of the things we did together was talk about our names. And we learned many of us have names that we would not have chosen for ourselves. And maybe using middle names instead of first names or whatever. And Barbara told us that a number of years ago, she chose the name for herself of Aurora. And after she died, I wrote these few lines about Aurora. Aurora, polar light, sleeping beauty, goddess of dawn, fierce soul, joyous warrior, suffragette in the crusade to be free, a woman, loving and laughing into happiness. There you were, seeking the source of many streams as you went cascading through the mysteries of consciousness, giving your boundlessness in small, digestible measures, dancing on both sides of the thin veil between now and before and next. My heart is still pinched, not yet able to let you go. I bring my grief to your table, knowing I will leave with more of you, more of me, when I go.
Anne.
That's that.
And thank you for sharing so much of you today, dear heart.
Well,
You were in every word you wrote.
well, this
Thank you.
was the challenge of that class, and has made it possible for me to do.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're all welcome.